She only asked for a glass of water. A simple request, one that every other first-class passenger received without question. But when the flight attendant glanced at the elderly couple, her expression changed. Her voice turned cold. "Water isn't available right now," she said, dismissing them like they were nothing. What she didn't know, the people she had just refused weren't just passengers. They owned the entire airline, and before this flight landed, she was going to learn exactly how big of a mistake she had just made. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane doors had just closed and the low hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. An elderly couple, Elias and Amara Duval, sat quietly in the first-class section, their movement slow but steady as they adjusted their seatbelts. Elias reached for Amara's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, a silent reassurance between them. They had taken many flights before, but this one felt different. Not because of the destination, but because of what was about to unfold. Across the aisle, Margot Keller, a senior flight attendant, moved briskly, her uniform crisp, her posture rigid. She had worked on flights for years and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she knew exactly who belonged where. As she scanned the passengers, her eyes landed on Elias and Amara. A brief flicker of disapproval crossed her face, barely noticeable, but it was there. She had seen many first-class travelers over the years, business executives, celebrities, politicians. But to her, this couple didn't fit the usual mold. Their clothes were elegant but understated, their manner quiet, almost too polite. Something about them made her assume they didn't belong. She turned away, attending to others without a second thought. The service began, drinks were poured, and first-class passengers received their usual comfort. Elias and Amara waited patiently, watching as glasses of sparkling water and chilled wine were placed in front of others. When Margot finally approached their row, Elias offered a warm smile. His voice was soft, steady, carrying the weight of years behind it as he made a simple request. "Could we have some water, please?" Margot's expression barely changed, but her hesitation spoke louder than words. She glanced at them, then at the tray she carried where fresh glasses sat untouched. With a small forced smile, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but water isn't available right now. We'll be serving drinks later." Elias exchanged a brief look with Amara before nodding. He didn't argue, he didn't push. But the pause before he spoke again was long enough to make the moment feel heavier. "I see. Thank you." She moved on quickly, dismissing them like they were just another minor inconvenience. Elias and Amara remained quiet, their expressions unreadable. But there was something in the way they sat, something too still, too patient. Amara reached into her handbag, pulling out a book, flipping through the pages as if nothing had happened. Elias leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. If anyone had been paying attention, they might have noticed the way his jaw tensed just a little, the way his eyes shifted toward Margot as she laughed at a joke from a passenger 2 rows ahead. A few feet away, Tessa Grant, a junior flight attendant, had been watching the exchange. She had been working under Margot for the past year, and though she respected her experience, something about the way she handled certain passengers never sat right with her. Tessa's hands tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. She wanted to say something, but she knew better. Speaking up against a senior crew member never ended well. Time passed, and the first-class service continued without interruption. Margot made her rounds, engaging in polite conversations, offering refills to those she deemed worthy of her attention. Not once did she glance back at Elias and Amara. Not once did she reconsider her decision. She had already determined in her mind that they weren't like the others. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the very people she had dismissed so easily were not just any passengers. They were not here by accident, and they were not here because of some system glitch. They had more authority on this flight than she could ever imagine, And before this plane landed, the mistake she had just made would cost her more than she could have ever predicted. Margot continued moving through the first-class cabin, her steps light, her demeanor unchanged. She had been a flight attendant long enough to know which passengers needed special attention and which ones could be ignored without consequence. In her mind, Elias and Amara Duval fell into the second category. They weren't the type to complain or demand special treatment. If they were unhappy, they would grumble to themselves and move on. She had seen it before. Across the aisle, Elias folded his hands in his lap, his face unreadable. Amara turned a page in her book, but she wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on the words, but her mind was elsewhere. She had noticed everything. The way Margot hesitated before denying them water. The way she had glanced at other passengers as if silently inviting them to agree with her decision. The way she had walked away as if they didn't matter. It was a quiet insult, one wrapped in politeness but unmistakable nonetheless. Tessa Grant, still holding a tray of refreshments, hesitated near the galley. She had seen plenty of entitled passengers in first class before, people who demanded extra service just because they could. But Elias and Amara, they had been nothing but polite. There was no reason for Margot to have treated them like that. Tessa glanced toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit door remained closed. She had an uneasy feeling about all of this. Back in his seat, Elias slowly pulled out his phone from his jacket pocket. The device was set to airplane mode, but that didn't matter. He scrolled through his saved messages, his thumb hovering over a contact labeled Operations HQ. He didn't send anything, not yet. Instead, he placed the phone on his knee, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge. A few rows ahead, Margot was laughing again, chatting with a well-dressed businessman who had ordered a second glass of champagne. She refilled his drink without hesitation, leaning slightly as she spoke to him, flashing her practiced smile. The contrast was clear. Some passengers deserved attention, while others could be dismissed. Elias exhaled softly. Amara finally closed her book, setting it aside. She turned to her husband, her voice low, steady. "Are you going to say something?" Elias's lips curved into a slight knowing smile. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his phone once more, this time typing a single message. Flight 428. Issue on board. Address it. The message remained unsent for now. But soon, that would change. Amara leaned back in her seat, glancing toward the aisle where Margot continued her rounds. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes. Something patient. Something knowing. She had seen this before. People like Margot had existed long before this flight and would exist long after it. But what Margot didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that this time she had picked the wrong passengers. And before this flight was over, she would realize just how costly that mistake was going to be. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the quiet murmur of conversations. First-class passengers remained comfortable, some sipping their drinks, others adjusting their seats for a nap. Elias and Amara sat still, their presence unnoticed by most, but the tension surrounding them was growing, quiet yet undeniable. Margot Keller, oblivious to the shift in energy, continued her duties with ease. She had been on this route plenty of times, and to her this flight was no different. The elderly couple she had dismissed earlier had not called her back, had not insisted on their request. That was enough to confirm her assumption. They were harmless. Tessa Grant, however, wasn't so sure. She had been keeping an eye on them, on the way Elias had placed his phone on his knee, on the unreadable expression that remained fixed on his face. Amara's silence, too, felt deliberate, as if she were waiting for something. Tessa had a bad feeling, the kind that sat at the bottom of her stomach like a stone. She finally found a moment to step into the galley, pretending to adjust a stack of napkins while she spoke in a hushed tone. "Margot, are you sure about what you said earlier?" Margot barely spared her a glance as she organized a tray. "About what?" Tessa lowered her voice. "The couple in seat 2C and 2D, the ones who asked for water." Margot let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Oh, please, Tessa. Don't tell me you're feeling bad about that. I told them drinks would be served later. But you didn't say that to anyone else, Tessa pointed out. Margot sighed, finally looking up. Listen, I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's trying to get something extra. You'll learn that too, eventually. Tessa frowned. It was just water. Margot shrugged. And they'll get it when I decide it's time. With that, she picked up a tray and exited the galley, leaving Tessa standing there, uneasy. Back in first class, Elias checked his watch. It had been nearly an hour since Margot had denied them their request. He didn't like making scenes, didn't like unnecessary conflict, but there were moments when silence was not the right response. Without a word, he picked up his phone again. His fingers moved swiftly as he sent a message, the kind that required no explanation. Message sent. At that same moment inside the cockpit, the in-flight phone lit up. The co-pilot glanced at the notification, then turned to the captain, a frown forming. Sir, we've got a direct request from operations. They need to confirm a situation in first class. Captain Raymond Dalton narrowed his eyes. What kind of situation? The co-pilot hesitated before answering. A passenger complaint, but it's not coming through the usual channels. He turned the screen slightly, revealing the sender's name. Dalton's expression shifted immediately. He sat up straighter, his entire demeanor sharpening. Patch me through to ground control, he ordered. The co-pilot nodded, already dialing. In the cabin, Margot continued moving through the aisles, completely unaware that the balance of power had just shifted. The call had been made. The wheels were in motion, and she was running out of time before everything changed. Margot moved through the cabin, her expression composed, her steps steady. She had no idea that at that very moment, a conversation was unfolding in the cockpit, one that would decide her fate before the flight even touched the ground. Inside the cockpit, Captain Raymond Dalton listened intently as the voice from ground control came through the speaker. The message was brief, direct, and impossible to ignore. Captain, you have a situation in first class involving 2 priority passengers. Immediate verification is required. Dalton's grip on the controls tightened slightly. Priority passengers? The reply was firm. Yes, sir. Mr. and Mrs. Duval. The captain's breath hitched for half a second before he masked his reaction. He had been flying for years and had encountered high-profile individuals before, but this was different. The Duvals weren't just any passengers. They were the owners of Everett Airways, the very airline they were flying on. Dalton turned to his co-pilot. Do we have an incident report from the crew? The co-pilot checked the logs. No, sir. No formal complaints have been filed. That was even more concerning. If the Duvals had escalated the matter directly through ground control instead of filing a simple onboard complaint, that meant something had gone seriously wrong. Dalton exhaled slowly, already knowing what had to be done. Patch me through to the lead flight attendant. Back in first class, Margot had just finished pouring another round of champagne when the in-flight phone at the front of the cabin buzzed. She glanced at it, mildly annoyed. It was never good when the cockpit called mid-flight. She set down the tray, dusted off her uniform, and walked over. With a practiced smile, she picked up the receiver. This is Margot Keller, first-class lead. The voice on the other end was calm but laced with unmistakable authority. Ms. Keller, this is Captain Dalton. I need you to immediately verify the status of 2 passengers, Elias and Amara Duval. Margot stiffened, glancing instinctively toward their seats. The couple was still there, sitting quietly, unmoving as if nothing had happened. Everything is fine, Captain, she said smoothly. I don't believe there's an issue. There was a pause on the other end, and then the captain's next words sent a chill through her. Then why did the owners of this airline file a direct report about mistreatment on this flight? Margot's mouth went dry. For the first time since the plane had taken off, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a complete and total loss of control. She gripped the phone tighter. Sir, Don't speak. Listen carefully, Dalton interrupted. his voice carrying a weight that made Margot's pulse quicken. "You will go to their seats. You will personally verify that they have received every courtesy due to them as first-class passengers. And if I find out that you failed to meet that standard," he paused, "you will not be wearing that uniform when we land." Margot swallowed hard, nodding even though he couldn't see her. "Understood, Captain." The line went dead. For the first time in her career, Margot felt an unsettling tightness in her chest. She had made a mistake she could no longer undo. And as she turned to face the elderly couple she had dismissed so easily, she realized they were looking right at her. Margot stood frozen for a moment, gripping the phone as if it could anchor her against the sudden shift in power. Her breath came a little too fast, her heartbeat too loud. The weight of Captain Dalton's words settled over her like a thick fog, the owners of the airline. The words repeated in her head over and over, clashing violently against the assumptions she had made just an hour ago. Slowly, she turned her head toward Elias and Amara Duval. They were looking right at her. Their expressions were calm, too calm. They hadn't said a word, hadn't raised their voices, hadn't demanded anything. And yet, they had made one call, and now Margot's entire reality had changed. She felt her throat tighten as she smoothed out her uniform, trying to regain some composure. She needed to fix this. Fast. With stiff steps, she made her way toward their row. The first-class cabin had quieted slightly, as if passengers could sense the shift in the air. A few heads turned as Margot reached Elias and Amara's seats. She forced a polite smile, the kind she had given to so many others before. But this time it felt thin, weak, hollow. She cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Duval," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I wanted to check if you were comfortable and if there's anything I can get for you." Elias looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that held more meaning than words ever could. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth and quiet. "Now you ask." Margot's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Amara set down her book, tilting her head slightly as she regarded Margot. "You seemed rather busy earlier," she said, her tone light, almost conversational. "What changed?" Margot swallowed. The way they were looking at her like they already knew everything made her skin prickle. "I apologize if I gave the impression that I was not attentive to your needs," she said quickly, choosing her words carefully. "We were preparing service at the time, but I'd be happy to bring you anything now." Elias's gaze didn't waver. He studied her, quiet, composed, as if considering something far bigger than just a cup of water. Then finally he spoke. "That's very kind of you," he said softly. "Water will be fine." Margot almost let out a breath of relief. "Of course, sir. Right away." She turned quickly, eager to retreat to the galley, to do something that might fix the damage she had done. But as she walked away, she could feel the weight of their gazes still on her back. She had no control now, and worse, she had no idea what they were going to do next. Margot reached the galley with quick, stiff steps, her fingers trembling slightly as she grabbed a glass. Her usual confidence had been replaced with something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The same passengers she had ignored before had just turned her world upside down with a single phone call. She poured the water carefully, watching as the clear liquid filled the glass. Just water. That was all they had asked for, and yet her refusal had led to something far beyond a simple service mistake. Behind her, Tessa Grant watched, her arms crossed over her chest. She had seen the way Margot had walked back, less sure of herself, less powerful. Tessa didn't know exactly what had been said over the phone, but she knew one thing. Margot had messed up. Badly. Margot picked up the tray, taking a deep breath before turning back toward the first-class cabin. Tessa spoke before she could leave. "So, are they still not priority passengers?" Margot shot her a sharp look, her fingers tightening around the tray. "Stay out of it, Tessa." But Tessa only smiled slightly, leaning against the counter. Oh, don't worry, I will. But something tells me you won't be able to. Margot ignored her, walking back toward Elias and Amara with a forced composure. The first-class cabin had grown noticeably quieter, some passengers subtly watching as she made her way to the elderly couple's seats. She stopped beside them, placing the glass on the tray table with the same practiced grace she had used countless times before. "Your water, sir, ma'am." Elias didn't pick up the glass immediately. Instead, he looked at it for a moment, then up at Margot. "Interesting," he murmured. Margot forced a polite smile. "Is something wrong, sir?" Amara reached for the glass, lifting it gently. "Oh, no," she said softly. "It's just... this seems like such a simple thing to do." Elias nodded slightly. "And yet it wasn't done when we first asked." Margot felt the heat rising in her face. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding." Elias let out a quiet chuckle. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice low and thoughtful. He leaned back slightly in his seat, resting his hands on the armrests. "Tell me, Ms. Keller, was it really a misunderstanding, or was it a choice?" Margot's throat went dry. She could feel the gaze of nearby passengers now, some pretending not to listen, others watching with open curiosity. Her usual tricks, her dismissive tone, her practiced authority, her ability to control the situation, none of them were working anymore. "I assure you," she said quickly, "there was no ill intention. I was simply following the usual service procedures." Elias held her gaze for a long moment, then smiled, but it wasn't a smile of acceptance. "Good," he said lightly, reaching for his phone. "Then I assume you won't mind explaining that to my board when we land." Margot's stomach dropped. She gripped her hands together, suddenly struggling to breathe. Whatever she had thought this was, a minor issue, a simple mistake. She now realized just how wrong she had been. This wasn't over, not even close. Margot felt a chill crawl up her spine. The board? Her throat tightened. She had handled plenty of difficult passengers before, brushed off complaints and smoothed over misunderstandings with carefully worded apologies. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a complaint she could ignore. This was a direct confrontation from the owners of the airline. Elias held his phone loosely in his hand, his expression still calm, almost too calm. His words had been soft, measured, yet they carried a weight that pressed against Margot's chest like a stone. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, she didn't know what to do. Amara took a small sip of the water she had been denied earlier, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the glass. "We've flown many times before," she said in a quiet, thoughtful tone. "We've had all kinds of service, some excellent, some average. But this," she turned her gaze to Margot. "This was deliberate." Margot's hands clenched slightly. I can assure you, Mrs. Duval, there was nothing deliberate about it." Elias hummed under his breath, still looking at his phone, as if considering his next move. "Then why did no one else in this cabin have to wait for their drinks?" he asked, his voice light but firm. "Why did every other first-class passenger receive immediate service?" Margot's mouth opened, but no words came out. She could feel the cabin watching now, the subtle shift in energy, the way passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now paying close attention. She could see Tessa standing near the galley, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elias finally glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to hear your explanation, Ms. Keller," he said, "right now." Margot's pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent years perfecting the art of controlling situations, of making passengers comply, of ensuring everything ran smoothly under her watch. But this was something she couldn't control. Her carefully built authority was crumbling, and for the first time in a very long time, she realized she had no power here. She took a shallow breath. "Mr. Duval, But before she could find an excuse, the in-flight phone rang again. The sound was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Every nerve in Margot's body tensed. She turned toward the front of the cabin, knowing exactly who was on the other end. Captain Dalton. And this time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to answer. Because whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. The in-flight phone kept ringing, its sound slicing through the tense silence of the first-class cabin. Margot Keller had never been afraid of a phone call before. She had taken complaints, dealt with irate passengers, smoothed over misunderstandings. This was part of her job. But this was different because this time the power was not in her hands. With stiff fingers, she picked up the receiver. "This is Margot Keller," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Captain Dalton's voice came through, low and controlled. "Ms. Keller, you are to immediately escort Mr. and Mrs. Duval to the forward lounge area. You will ensure they are given every courtesy. And when you return to your station, you will prepare a written incident report before landing." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. "Captain, Dalton cut her off, his voice cold as steel. "I am not asking." The line clicked off. Margot's grip tightened around the phone before she slowly placed it back onto the receiver. Her mind raced. An incident report? An escort to the forward lounge? That wasn't standard procedure for a minor complaint. That was what they did for VIPs, for people who held the power to make or break careers. She had underestimated them. She had underestimated them badly. Margot turned around, but before she could even speak, Elias was already rising from his seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, filled with the kind of quiet authority that came from someone who had spent years in control of much bigger things than a flight crew. Amara set her glass of water down gently on the tray table, smoothing out the fabric of her dress as she stood beside him. The elderly couple had not raised their voices once. They had not demanded attention, nor had they caused a scene. And yet, with nothing more than patience and a single phone call, they had sent Margot into a free fall. She cleared her throat, forcing a polite tone. "If you'll follow me." Mr. and Mrs. Duval Elias gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "Of course." As Margot turned, leading them toward the private first-class lounge, she could feel the eyes of every passenger in the cabin burning into her back. They knew something was happening. They had all watched her ignore Elias and Amara earlier. They had all seen the way she had dismissed them. And now, they were seeing her escort them personally, something she had never done for anyone before. Margot's chest tightened. She hated this. She had spent her career commanding respect, controlling the cabin, ensuring that things ran the way she decided they should. But this wasn't just a shift in control. This was a complete reversal. Tessa stood near the galley, her arms crossed as Margot passed by with Elias and Amara. Their eyes met briefly. Tessa didn't smirk. She didn't say anything, but her expression said enough. "You did this to yourself." Margot's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned away, focusing on the long walk to the forward lounge. Every step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the private area, Margot stepped aside, her posture rigid as she gestured toward the luxurious seating inside. "Please make yourselves comfortable." Elias stepped inside first, followed by Amara. Neither of them spoke as they sat down, settling in as if they owned the space. Because they did. Margot lingered for a second too long, waiting, unsure of what to say. Finally, Elias looked up, his eyes steady. "That will be all, Ms. Keller." His voice was calm, polite, dismissive, the way she had been earlier. Margot's fingers curled slightly at her sides, but she forced a nod. "Of course, sir." She turned stiffly and walked away, but she already knew. This wasn't over. Because when they landed, she wasn't just writing an incident report. She was facing the people who could decide whether she ever worked in this uniform again. Margot walked back toward the main cabin, her steps stiff, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She was unraveling. Every part of her training told her to remain composed, to maintain control of the situation. But this wasn't just a situation anymore. This was something much bigger, something she had no power over. As she reached the first-class section again, she could feel every pair of eyes on her. The same passengers who had ignored Elias and Amara before were now watching closely, whispering, glancing at one another. The shift had happened. They had seen her attitude earlier, the dismissal in her tone, the way she had refused something as simple as water. And now? Now she had been forced to personally escort them to a private lounge. Now she had been exposed. She reached the galley, exhaling sharply, her fingers gripping the counter as she steadied herself. Tessa was there, standing just a few feet away, watching her. Not smug, not gloating, just waiting. Margot could feel it, the unspoken tension, the judgment. After a long pause, Tessa finally spoke. "So, what's the official reason they're in the lounge?" Margot didn't answer. Tessa clicked her tongue. "Right. Got it." Margot turned sharply, her patience snapping. "I don't need your comments right now." Tessa shrugged, unfazed. "I'm not making comments. I'm just wondering how it feels." Margot narrowed her eyes. "How what feels?" Tessa leaned against the counter, tilting her head slightly. "Being treated like you don't belong." The words hit harder than Margot expected. For a second, she had nothing to say. Tessa didn't press further. She simply gave a small, knowing nod before grabbing a tray and walking past, heading toward the passengers who still needed service. Margot clenched her jaw, staring down at the counter. She hated this. But more than anything, she hated that Tessa was right. She had always been the one deciding who got special treatment, who was worth her time. She had never been on the other side of that. Until now. She forced a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. She needed to fix this. Maybe if she wrote her report carefully, if she framed it as a simple misunderstanding, maybe she could save herself. But before she could even finish that thought, the in-flight phone buzzed again. Her stomach twisted. Not again. She picked it up hesitantly. "This is Margot Keller." The voice on the other end was not Captain Dalton this time. It was a voice she had never spoken to directly before, but one she had heard of. A name that carried far more weight than any pilot, any executive, anyone she had ever feared facing in her career. The voice was calm, precise, unshaken. "This is Everett Duval." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. Everett Duval, the founder of Everett Airways, the father of Elias Duval, the man whose name was on the very aircraft she was flying in. Her hands began to sweat. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "Mr. Duval, sir, Ms. Keller," Everett interrupted smoothly. "My son has informed me of an issue on board. I would like you to explain it to me, personally." Margot couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a bad situation anymore. This was a disaster. Margot's fingers tightened around the phone, her knuckles turning white. Everett Duval. She had never spoken to him before. Few people in her position had. He was a legend in the airline industry, the kind of man whose presence commanded instant respect. Even the highest-ranking executives feared him, and now he was speaking directly to her. Her mouth went dry as she struggled to form words. "Sir, Everett's voice remained calm but firm. "Miss Keller, let's not waste time. My son and daughter-in-law are on that flight. I have received a report that they were denied basic service, that they were treated with disrespect." He let the word hang in the air, sharp and heavy. "I'd like to hear your version of the event." Margot felt lightheaded. There was no version of the event that would save her. She couldn't lie. The Duvals had already escalated the situation through direct channels. She knew how this worked. If Everett Duval was personally calling mid-flight, it meant he had already seen everything he needed to see. But admitting her mistake outright? That would be career suicide. I believe there was a misunderstanding, sir," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was following standard service procedures and perhaps there was some miscommunication." Silence. Then Everett exhaled lightly. "Miscommunication?" Margot clenched her teeth. His tone told her everything. He wasn't buying it. She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I can assure you I had no intention of treating Mr. and Mrs. Duval unfairly." A pause. Then Everett spoke again, slower this time. "Tell me, Ms. Keller, His voice was eerily controlled, too controlled. "Do you always refuse water to first-class passengers?" Margot's breath hitched. I don't refuse service, sir." "That's not what I asked." His voice dropped slightly, the weight behind it pressing into her. "I asked if this was standard. Do you deny water to all first-class passengers? Or just some?" Margot's pulse pounded in her ears. She felt trapped. This was the exact question she had no good answer for. She opened her mouth, scrambling for words, but her mind wasn't working fast enough. Everett's voice came again, smooth, unhurried. "I expect full transparency in my airline, Ms. Keller. I built Everett Airways on integrity. So I'll ask you one more time, when Mr. and Mrs. Duval requested water, why was it denied?" Margot was drowning. She couldn't admit the real reason. That she had made an assumption, that she had decided, based on nothing more than a glance, that they weren't the kind of people who belonged in first class. If she said that out loud, it was over. Completely, irreversibly over. Her throat was too tight to swallow. "Think, Margot. Think." But before she could even attempt another excuse, Everett spoke one last time. "I expect your resignation upon landing." The words slammed into her like a blow. Margot froze. Her whole body went cold. I beg your pardon?" she choked out. Everett's voice didn't waver. "You heard me, Ms. Keller. You are no longer employed with Everett Airways. Upon landing, you will hand over your badge and uniform to the first officer on duty. Do not attempt to argue. This is final." Margot staggered against the counter, gripping it for balance. "No, sir, please." Her voice cracked, desperation creeping in. This was an oversight. Everett cut her off, his tone still calm, but now completely cold. "You should have thought of that before you decided who was worthy of service on my aircraft." The line went dead. Margot stood there, still clutching the phone, her breathing shallow. She had lost everything, her career, her authority, her entire future in aviation gone. She felt a crushing weight in her chest. And then, slowly, she turned. Tessa was standing in the galley doorway, her arms crossed. She had heard everything. Margot's mouth opened, but she couldn't find any words. Tessa simply raised an eyebrow. "Well," she said after a beat, "that didn't go well, did it?" Margot's hands shook. She clenched them into fists, forcing back the nausea rising in her throat. Passengers were still watching her. Whispers were spreading. And now, for the first time in her entire career, Margot Keller had no idea what to do next. Margot stood frozen, gripping the counter so tightly that her nails dug into the smooth surface. The words, "I expect your resignation upon landing," echoed in her head, circling like a vulture over the remains of her career. This wasn't happening. Her hands shook. Her stomach twisted. She had to fix this. She turned sharply to Tessa, her voice low but frantic. "You didn't hear that." Tessa blinked at her, then let out a short laugh. Not cruel, but certainly not sympathetic. "Oh, I absolutely did." Margot's jaw clenched. "Tessa, listen to me. This isn't what it looks like." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is." She took a slow step closer, her voice quieter but sharper. "You refused to serve 2 passengers. You made an assumption about who they were. And now?" She tilted her head. "Now you're paying for it." Margot's breath hitched. "I didn't mean..." Tessa held up a hand. Stop. Her voice was calm, but there was something firm behind it. "You don't get to backpedal now. You don't get to say it was a misunderstanding, because we both know it wasn't." Margot felt sick. She had spent years building herself into the person who made the rules in the cabin. And now, in a matter of hours, she had been stripped of everything. Her fingers twitched at her sides. "I need to talk to Captain Dalton," she said suddenly. He can override this. He can..." Tessa let out a sharp breath. "Are you serious right now? You think you can undo what just happened?" She shook her head, almost amused by the delusion. "Margot, Everett Duval himself just fired you. Do you really think anyone on this plane outranks him?" Margot hated the way her name sounded in Tessa's voice, hated the fact that she was right. Her throat was dry. I can explain. I can tell them I wasn't thinking clearly. Tessa's expression darkened. No, you were thinking exactly how you always do. That's the problem. Margot opened her mouth to snap back, but before she could, the in-flight phone rang again. Her stomach lurched. She stared at it like it might physically strike her. Tessa glanced at the phone, then at Margot. Aren't you going to answer? Margot's throat tightened. She reached for the receiver, her fingers trembling, and pressed it to her ear. This is Margot Keller. This time it was Captain Dalton, and he sounded furious. Ms. Keller, I need you in the cockpit now. The line went dead. Margot closed her eyes, breathed in, breathed out. Tessa took a step back, giving her space, but her voice still reached her, soft but pointed. Looks like you're finally out of places to hide. Margot didn't reply. She didn't have the energy. Her legs felt stiff as she walked through the first-class section, past the same passengers she had so confidently ignored earlier. The ones who had seen her humiliate Elias and Amara. The ones who had watched her march them to the lounge in a desperate attempt to fix her mistake. They knew what was happening. She felt their gazes, felt the shift, the silent judgment. She had been in control this morning. Now she was the one being scrutinized. Margot reached the cockpit door, took one last breath, and knocked. A second later, the door unlocked with a sharp click. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Captain Dalton was waiting, and he didn't look pleased. The cockpit was quiet, save for the steady hum of the engines. The co-pilot seated beside him kept his eyes on the controls, clearly choosing to stay out of whatever was about to happen. Dalton leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. His expression was unreadable, calm, professional. But his eyes told Margot everything she needed to know. She swallowed hard. Captain, Dalton held up a hand. Number you, listen. Margot shut her mouth. Dalton exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. You had one job, Keller. Margot flinched slightly at the use of her last name. You were supposed to ensure every passenger in your section received the service they paid for. That was it. His voice didn't rise, didn't carry anger, but the weight of his disappointment was worse than yelling. Yet, instead, you chose to ignore 2 passengers based on nothing but your own assumptions. Margot's fingers twitched. I didn't. Dalton shot her a sharp look, and she shut up immediately. Do you think I enjoy having corporate call me mid-flight? He asked. Do you think I like having to deal with this kind of situation at 30,000 feet? Margot felt herself shrinking. No, sir. Dalton studied her for a moment, then let out a low chuckle. But it wasn't amusement. It was frustration. I've been a captain for 20 years, he said, shaking his head. I've flown world leaders, celebrities, CEOs, and do you know the one thing they all have in common? Margot didn't answer. Dalton held up a finger. They don't want to be treated differently. He let that sink in. Mr. and Mrs. Duval didn't board this flight looking for special treatment. They didn't demand 5-star service. They didn't even ask for anything that wasn't already included in their ticket. He leaned forward slightly. They asked for water. Margot felt her stomach twist. Dalton's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. You disrespected the people who own this airline over a glass of water. Margot's mouth was dry. Dalton exhaled again, rubbing his temple before shaking his head. Everett Duval didn't have to fire you personally. He could have let corporate handle it. But he did. Do you know why? Margot could barely nod. Dalton leaned back. Because he wanted you to understand how badly you screwed up. Silence. Margot stood there, feeling the weight of everything. She had lost her job, her reputation, her entire career. Dalton glanced at the clock. We land in 40 minutes. I suggest you use that time wisely. Margot nodded stiffly, forcing her voice to remain steady. Yes, sir. Dalton turned away, dismissing her. Close the door behind you. Margot stepped out of the cockpit, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. And then, she stood there. She had no duties left, no authority. She was just waiting to land, waiting for the moment she would step off this plane as a passenger, and nothing more. Margot walked back through the first-class cabin, but this time, she wasn't the same person who had boarded the flight. Everything had shifted. She wasn't the senior flight attendant anymore. She wasn't the one giving orders, setting the tone, controlling the cabin. She was just another person on the plane. And now she had nowhere to go. Her steps were slower, heavier. The chatter in first class was softer than before, the atmosphere tinged with curiosity, caution, even quiet judgment. Passengers who had once ignored her now watched her without a trace of the deference she was used to. They had seen what happened. They had heard the way she had refused Elias and Amara, and now they were watching her walk back, disgraced. Margot reached the galley, her fingers pressing against the cool metal counter as she tried to steady herself. Her hands were shaking. Tessa stood nearby, quietly stacking cups, pretending to focus on her work. But Margot knew she wasn't pretending very hard. Tessa hadn't spoken since she had walked out of the cockpit. She didn't need to. The silence between them was thick, unspoken, damning. Margot exhaled shakily. "You must be enjoying this," she muttered under her breath. Tessa's hands didn't stop moving. "Not really." Margot turned to her sharply. "Oh, don't pretend you don't love watching me fall apart." Tessa finally looked up, meeting her gaze. But her expression wasn't mocking. It was disappointed. "Margot, I don't enjoy watching anyone fall apart," she said, her voice quieter. "But I do think you had this coming." Margot felt her jaw tighten. "You don't know anything about me." Tessa sighed, placing the last cup onto the stack before turning fully toward her. "I know enough." Margot hated the way Tessa was looking at her, like she wasn't angry, just resigned, like she had seen this so many times before. "You know," Tessa continued, crossing her arms, "I used to think you were strict because you wanted things done the right way, that you were tough because you cared about keeping things professional. But that wasn't it, was it?" Margot forced a breath. "I did what needed to be done." Tessa tilted her head slightly. "Or did you just like deciding who deserved what?" Margot froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then quietly, Tessa added, "That's why this is happening to you. Not because of one mistake, but because of a pattern." Margot felt anger, shame, resentment, all of it swirling inside her like a storm. But the worst part was that Tessa was right. Before Margot could respond, the intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Dalton. We have begun our initial descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Margot swallowed hard. This was it. The countdown had begun. 40 minutes. Now, less than 10. She was minutes away from stepping off this plane for the last time. She took a slow, unsteady breath and turned to Tessa one last time. "I'll be gone after this," Margot said, her voice hoarse. Tessa nodded once. "I know." Margot hesitated. "Does that make you happy?" Tessa studied her for a long moment. Then she sighed. "No," she admitted, "but I hope it makes you think." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Margot standing there, alone. Margot exhaled shakily, running a hand through her hair. The plane dipped slightly as it continued its descent, the city below coming into view. This was really happening. No more excuses, no more control. For the first time in years, Margot Keller had no idea what came next. Margot stood frozen in the galley, the quiet hum of the plane's descent pressing around her like a weight she couldn't shake. Her mind raced, but there was nowhere left to run. The reality of her situation had settled in now, fully and completely. In a matter of minutes, the wheels would touch down, and the life she had built, the career she had spent years perfecting, the authority she had wielded like a shield, would disappear. She gripped the counter, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. This couldn't be happening, but it was. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. She had spent years making snap judgments, deciding in an instant who was worth her time and who wasn't. She had convinced herself it was just professionalism, just a matter of efficiency. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been playing God with people's dignity. And this time, she had miscalculated. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Maybe she could still fix this. Maybe if she found the right words, if she explained herself properly, someone would understand. Captain Dalton, the board, maybe even Everett Duval himself. There had to be a way to undo this. She turned, ready to march back to the cockpit and plead her case. But just as she stepped forward, she stopped, because Elias and Amara Duval were standing just outside the galley watching her. Her stomach dropped. Their presence was calm, controlled. Nothing about them looked angry. That made it worse. Margot had dealt with angry passengers before. Anger was easy. Anger could be managed, redirected. But this quiet, composed power, this was something she couldn't control. Elias adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Keller." Margot forced herself to stand up straighter. Mr. Duval Amara tilted her head slightly, studying her. "You look troubled." Margot's throat tightened. Elias held up a hand, silencing whatever weak excuse she had been about to make. "We don't need an explanation," he said simply. "We know exactly what happened." Margot felt humiliated. Her mouth was dry. I didn't mean any harm." Elias let out a low hum. "Didn't you?" Margot's skin burned. Amara sighed softly. "It's funny," she murmured. "You never once thought twice when you dismissed us. But now that you're the one being dismissed, you suddenly want understanding." Margot's hands curled into fists at her sides. Not out of defiance, out of shame, because she had nothing to say. She had treated them like they didn't belong, like they weren't worth her time, her respect, her bare minimum courtesy. And now, they were looking at her like she was the one who had to prove herself. Elias exhaled slowly, then said something that stopped Margot's heart in her chest. "I spoke to my father again." Her breath hitched. Elias's eyes met hers. "He's reconsidering your termination." Margot's head snapped up. "What?" Amara nodded. "He doesn't believe in immediate dismissals," she said. "He believes in accountability." Margot felt her stomach twist. "So I'm not fired?" Elias smiled faintly, but there was no kindness in it. Only patience. "Not yet," he said. "Not unless you make the wrong choice now." Margot's pulse pounded in her ears. "The wrong choice?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias's expression remained steady. "We're landing soon. When we do, you'll have a choice. Walk off this plane quietly, pretending none of this ever happened, and never work for this airline again." Margot stilled. Elias's voice didn't change. "Or," he continued, "you walk off this plane, own what you did, and prove that you can do better." Margot's chest tightened. Amara crossed her arms. "You're a senior flight attendant, aren't you?" Margot nodded slowly. "So act like one," Amara said softly. "Or don't. But understand, this is your last chance to decide what kind of person you want to be." Margot felt her world tilting beneath her feet. She had expected fury. She had expected punishment. But this was something else entirely. Elias adjusted his cuff again, checking his watch. "You have about 5 minutes before we land. Choose wisely." And then, without another word, they walked away. Margot stood frozen in place. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to decide what came next. To decide whether she was going to walk away from this in shame, or walk into the unknown and try to be better. Her hands trembled. She had never been this afraid in her life. The aircraft dipped slightly, the smooth shift signaling that the runway was close. The city lights stretched below, glittering like a sea of tiny stars against the fading dusk. Margot Keller had never felt so small. She was running out of time. The final decision had been placed in her hands, a decision she had never expected. Elias and Amara hadn't crushed her. They hadn't demanded she be thrown out of the airline like she had feared. Instead, they had done something far worse. They had left the choice to her. That was what terrified her the most. Margot wasn't used to looking at herself, really looking. She had spent years moving up the ranks, learning how to hold her head high, how to control situations, how to make herself untouchable. She had been good at it too. But now, she wasn't untouchable anymore. Now she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't explain. She could still walk away. No one would stop her. The moment the wheels touched down, she could gather her things, take off her uniform, and disappear. She could pretend none of this had happened. She could blame the system, the circumstances, bad luck. Or she could own what she did. She could take the fall, not as a victim, but as someone who had earned it. The thought made her stomach churn, because deep down, she already knew the truth. This wasn't just about Elias and Amara. This was about who she had always been. She had spent years deciding who mattered, who was worthy of attention, who was important enough for her to care about. And for what? Where had that gotten her? Now, she was the one being judged, the one being dismissed, and it was the first time in her life that she understood what it felt like. Her hands tightened into fists, her breath uneven. The overhead announcement crackled on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, all personal items are secured, and tray tables are in their locked positions. We will be arriving at our destination shortly." Margot swallowed hard. She had spent so long thinking power meant being the one in control. Maybe real power was something else entirely. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the first-class lounge. The doors were closed, but she knew Elias and Amara were still inside, still waiting, still watching. She could walk away, she could hide. Or, Margot inhaled sharply. She turned, walking straight toward the front of the cabin. Her steps were steady, controlled, but this time they didn't carry the same arrogance they once did. Passengers turned their heads as she moved past, some whispering. She ignored them. She reached the first-class lounge. Her pulse pounded. For the first time in years, Margot Keller knocked on a door and waited. A second later, the door opened. Elias stood there, calm as ever, his sharp eyes scanning her face. Amara sat inside, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching just as intently. Margot took a breath, and then, for the first time since this flight began, she spoke without a single ounce of control. "I was wrong." The words tasted unfamiliar, heavy. Amara blinked. Elias remained still. Margot clenched her fists at her sides. "I was wrong," she repeated, her voice steadier. "About you. About all of it." Elias studied her. "Go on." Margot swallowed. "I've been in this job for years. I thought I knew how things worked. I thought I knew people. I thought I could just decide." Her throat felt tight. "But I didn't. I don't." She exhaled sharply. "I treated you unfairly," she admitted. "And not just you. Others. People who didn't fit the mold of who I thought deserved respect." She paused, her breath uneven. "That's on me. No one else. I won't make excuses." Amara tilted her head slightly, considering her. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Margot's jaw tightened. She had spent her whole life thinking apologies were weak. But now, standing in front of these two people, people who had every reason to walk away from her, she understood something. Apologies weren't weak, they were the hardest thing in the world. Margot lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in resolve. "I'll step down if that's what's required," she said honestly. "But if I get a second chance, I won't waste it." Elias said nothing. Margot's fingers twitched at her sides. Then, finally, after what felt like forever, Elias exhaled slowly. "You know," he murmured, "I believe you." Margot's breath hitched. She didn't know why. Maybe because it was the first time in a long time someone had looked at her and truly seen her. Amara smiled faintly, leaning back. "We'll see if you prove it." Margot nodded stiffly, and for the first time in her life she hoped, truly hoped she'd be able to. Outside, the wheels of the aircraft met the runway with a smooth, steady touch. The flight had ended. But for Margot Keller, the real journey had just begun. The wheels touched the runway with a smooth glide, a soft vibration running through the aircraft as it slowed down. The familiar chime of the seatbelt sign rang overhead, signaling the official end of the flight. But for Margot Keller, this wasn't just the end of a trip. It was the end of the person she had been, and the beginning of something else. She stood near the galley, her pulse steady but heavy. Around her, the first-class passengers stretched, gathering their belongings, chatting about their plans once they landed. The hum of conversation filled the space, but it all felt distant. Margot had spent years in this very moment. The post-flight routine, the closing of another shift, the relief of a job completed. But this time it was different. She turned slightly, her eyes drifting toward the first-class lounge where Elias and Amara Duval were seated. They hadn't rushed to leave. They were still watching. Waiting, not for service, not for special treatment, but for what Margot would do next. For the first time, she didn't want to disappoint them. A rustling noise caught her attention. The first-class passengers were now standing, forming a slow-moving line toward the exit. The curtain separating the cabin from business class had been pulled aside, revealing the rest of the aircraft beyond. Margot wasn't sure if she should move or stay. Her position here, her title, her authority, was gone. She had no duties left, no announcements to make, no passengers to direct. She was just here. A voice spoke from behind. "Well, Keller?" Margot turned. Captain Dalton stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed. His face wasn't as cold as before, but it was still firm. "You walking off as crew or as a passenger?" he asked. Margot hesitated. This was it. This was the moment that defined everything. If she walked off silently, she'd be done. The airline wouldn't fight Everett Duval's decision. She'd be a cautionary tale, a name on a list of former employees who had departed under circumstances. But if she stepped off as crew, even without her title, even without her authority, it meant something else. It meant she wasn't running. Margot exhaled slowly. She knew what she had to do. She squared her shoulders, then did something she hadn't done in years. She stepped back into the cabin, not as a flight attendant, not as a superior, but as someone who needed to face what she had done. Passengers passed by, some glancing at her, others ignoring her completely. A few of them had seen the events unfold. She could feel their judgment, their curiosity. And then, Elias and Amara stood. Margot straightened. Elias gave her a small nod. Not an approval, not praise, but something that felt heavier than both. A test, a question unspoken. Would she walk away again? Would she take the easy way out? Margot took a breath. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. She reached their row, standing before them as the rest of the cabin moved around her. She met their gazes, and then, for the first time, she didn't speak first. She waited. Amara studied her, then exhaled softly. "Well," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse, "I suppose we'll see if you meant what you said." Elias smirked slightly, not in amusement, but in quiet understanding. "Good luck, Miss Keller." Margot nodded, not because it was polite, not because she was expected to, but because she finally understood. Respect wasn't something you commanded. It wasn't something you controlled. It was something you earned. And for the first time in her life, Margot Keller wanted to earn it. She stepped aside, watching as Elias and Amara walked toward the exit. She didn't call after them, didn't demand anything, didn't expect them to look back. They had already given her far more than she deserved. When they disappeared into the terminal, Margot let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The last few passengers exited, leaving the cabin quiet, empty. She turned, expecting to see Captain Dalton still watching her. But the cockpit door was closed. She was alone. Margot walked to the forward galley, fingers running lightly along the smooth metal surfaces she had known for years. For the first time, she wasn't sure what came next. Would she still have a job? Would she even be allowed to prove herself? She had no idea, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to find out. With one last look at the aircraft she had once ruled over, Margot Keller took a breath and stepped into the unknown. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in this situation? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.